Great. Well, welcome everyone. It's my great pleasure to host this month's session of the Toronto Area French History Group. I'd like to begin today with a land acknowledgement. And I know that since we are meeting virtually from a wide range of places, we probably all have different relationships to the land wherever we may be. So I would encourage you to reflect on the land that you are currently on, who the traditional keepers of that land are, what the treaty relationship is, and whether it's unceded territory. Many of us today are from York University and the University of Toronto, which means we are physically in Toronto. So I'll just momentarily acknowledge this region. These are the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee. The territory is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, the meeting place of Takaranto is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to work on this land. I would like to also introduce the co-organizers of the history seminar this year. Although we are here virtually and you cannot see us all, we have Eric Jennings and William Nelson from the University of Toronto, and Deborah Neal and myself, Margaret Scotty, from York University. We would very much like to acknowledge the hosts and thank them for the financial support that goes into hosting this seminar series each year. We are indebted to the history departments at the University of Toronto and at York University, as well as at Glendon College. We'd also like to thank the Centre d'études de la France et du monde francophone, which is housed within the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at the Monk Center at U of T. And additionally, our series receives support from the French Cultural Services of the Embassy in Ottawa and the French Consulate in Toronto. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Nimisha Barton is currently a visiting researcher at the University of California at Irvine. She was trained in French history at Princeton University. Her first monograph, Reproductive Citizens, Gender, Immigration, and the State in France, 1900 to 1945, was published by Cornell in 2020. This study, which was based on Dr. Barton's dissertation, won the American Historical Association's J. Russell Major Book Prize for Best English Language Book in French History. It has also garnered honorable mentions from the Society of French Historical Studies and the Institute of French Studies at NYU. She has written a number of other articles on immigration and gender in French history and co-edited the 2019 volume, Practiced Citizenship, Women, Gender, and the State in Modern France. Alongside this rigorous and prize-winning scholarship, for the past decade, Dr. Barton has been an equity consultant in higher education, working with administrators and faculty to ensure equity in the classroom and on college campuses. Her second book, which is based on this important work, is entitled Just Future: From Diversity and Inclusion to Equity and Justice in Higher Education. And that volume will be forthcoming later this year, again from Cornell University Press. In recognition of Dr. Barton's work in both these important areas, she was recently awarded the Tyler Stovall Mission Prize by the Western Society for French History for her contributions to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the field of French and Francophone history and higher education more generally. I am very much looking forward to hearing her speak to us today on a talk entitled La pensee magique, a Turkish Sephardic Family Responds to Multigenerational Trauma. Without further ado, Dr. Barton.
Thank you so much. Are you all able to see my slides there? Yeah, we're good to go, Margaret? Okay, great. Well, thank you, Margaret, for inviting me and to all other invisible patrons right now. Margaret and I actually went to graduate school together, so this is a fun little virtual reunion. All right, so today, I want to talk about this family. So for over 20 years, Dan Starr Tamber has painstakingly collected every detail he can find about his grandmother, a woman with whom he shares a strong spiritual connection. He knows everything about her. She was the daughter of Turkish Jewish immigrants. She grew up in the 11th arrondissement of interwar Paris, along with her parents and 4 siblings. Her father and brother were arrested during the first Jewish roundups in 1941, and despite their efforts to bribe Drancy's staff and secure the release of their menfolk, she and her mother were ultimately unable to prevent their deportation. Dan had heard stories, too, of how the death of her husband and son had driven Luna's mother momentarily mad, nearly destroying her and endangering the 4 children she had left. So on a whim, Dan Googled this great-grandmother of his about a year ago in February 2022, and much to his surprise, a 1920s photograph of Joya Abuaf and 3 of her children instantly appeared on the screen. And in fact, they were on the cover of a very obscure book in French history called Reproductive Citizens. So not too long after that, I actually heard from Dan's sister, whose name is Alfie. And as it turns out, they've been making a documentary about her for some time now. And in yet another strange twist of fate, I came to learn that Alfie lived down the street from me in Los Angeles over here, like a 5-minute car ride. A deeply spiritual and almost mystical woman, Luna, who's the young girl on the left on the book cover, she inspires very strong emotions, some viewing her as unhinged, others as a visionary. And when describing her experiences during and after the war to her children and grandchildren, Luna often spoke of eerie premonitions and ethereal encounters. She spoke of communing with angels and reuniting with her dead father. In her 60s, Luna began to channel those memories into her art, depicting life in occupied Paris. And actually, one such painting hangs in the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, and it bears some of those telltale signs of her otherworldly preoccupations. So as you'll see later, angels will be flitting about, her Sephardic ancestors appear in the background, and throughout biblical themes suffuse it all. So today I want to tell you the story of this woman, Luna, and her family. We're going to start with Luna's parents, Moishe Abuaf and Joya Baralia, who first migrated to Paris in 1923. And while the Abuafs eventually had 5 children, I want to focus on that enigmatic eldest daughter of theirs, Luna, who is now living in the United States, in Florida. In a sense, my paper today is just trying to pick up from where my first book, Reproductive Citizens, left off. And as some of you may know, in that book, I looked at immigration in France, and I focused on a particularly melting pot neighborhood of working class Paris, that's the 11e. And I examined the role of gender, sexuality, and reproduction in the lives of immigrant men and women, and especially in their relationship to the French state. So that was a study that was very rooted in a specific place and specific quartier and community, right? The book's last chapter was set in occupied Paris because I wanted to understand the quality of neighborly relationships between French and foreign and French naturalized Jews in the Parisian neighborhood that I was studying. And it was in that chapter that I suggested that relationships between French and immigrant residents that had been built up throughout the previous decades actually held up during the occupation. And I also suggested that despite the Vichy state's very vicious anti-Semitic agenda, the French Republic's ongoing predisposition for protecting women and children sort of shielded some foreign-born Jewish mothers and families perhaps better than we previously thought. So picking up there, I want to move from a study of a neighborhood to the study of a family, examining how the trauma of war and occupation and extermination has rippled across 4 generations of a Turkish Jewish family whose forebears first put down roots in the melting pot Parisian neighborhood of La Roquette nearly 100 years ago, I guess exactly 100 years ago. I made a lot of claims in that last chapter, but do they hold up? Spoiler alert, yes, but by focusing on this one family, by following them from the Ottoman Empire to France and then to the United States, I have an opportunity to show in a more textured, more intimate way, the multi-generational effects of historical trauma across a much broader chronological, geographical, and emotional landscape. So before I get into Abuaf's story, I'm going to just provide a brief sketch of what may or may not be unorthodox frameworks that guide my project. And I just say this, I call them unorthodox because I don't imagine that this project, whatever it becomes, if it becomes anything, will be a traditional academic study. And I can discuss that more in the Q&A. But with that analytic background, I then want to share what we do know about the Aboua family. I want to home in on their experience during the Second World War in occupied Paris. And then before wrapping up, I want to shift our focus to Louise, who renamed herself Luna Star later in life. So in terms of scholarly interventions, quote unquote, I guess there are a few obvious avenues of scholarly inquiry, right? So how does the Aboua family story fit in the larger scholarly conversations about Jewish diaspora throughout the 19th and 20th centuries? What can this family story tell us about the assimilationist project in 20th century France? And what are the differences between the Ashkenazi versus the Sephardic experience of World War II and the Holocaust? I think those are all really interesting questions, and I do hope that eventually the project could perhaps speak to precisely those questions, but I admit that these are not the most important questions to me. I'm really interested in the human story about how the collective trauma of exile and migration and war and the Holocaust, how that trauma is passed down through the ages, and how Jewish mysticism, at least for Luna and perhaps also her mother Joya, provided a highly unique means of dealing with that trauma and perhaps also of healing. So these interests, they are academic in nature, but they're just maybe not what we're used to in the discipline of history. And instead, my research questions sort of press in other directions. And for me, that direction is trauma. So we've learned a lot about trauma in the last couple of decades. At the broadest level, I'd say that my approach is informed by Stacey Haynes. She's a pioneer in the field of somatic social justice and the author of The Politics of Trauma. For our purposes, I just want to focus on something that Haynes offers us. She pretty much just she argues that we need to engage in structural analyses of oppression that move beyond individualistic and interpersonal approaches to trauma. Instead, she tells us that we need to understand that the transformation of violent systems is a primary trauma prevention technique. So another way of saying all this is, in order to truly address the harm that people do to one another, we have to analyze what systems incentivize and motivate someone to do something harmful to begin with. Haynes actually defines structural or systemic trauma in the following way: the repeated, ongoing violation, exploitation, dismissal of, and end or deprivation of groups of people. And this is perpetrated by state institutions, economic systems, and social norms. And now Haynes' work is relatively recent, but I do think structural trauma offers us a framework to think about something that we may be more familiar with. That would be historical trauma or collective trauma. And that's something that psychologists and psychiatrists have been analyzing for decades. And I actually recently learned that this first started with a Lakota social worker named Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart in the 1980s. And she was interested in examining how colonization, genocide, forced relocations, forced assimilation, how that affected Lakota communities in the United States in the present. And so it was actually initially called indigenous trauma, historical trauma theory. And what I found really interesting is her emphasis on the fact that this is a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding that takes place over many generations. And she talks about this as a massive group trauma experience. So one example would be the impact of boarding schools on Native Americans or First Nations peoples. And this is actually an approach that is then applied to other communities who experience state-sanctioned violence. So, of course, Jews who survived the Holocaust, but also even more recently, I'd say Black Americans in the United States as well. Now, psychologists and psychiatrists have shown great interest in how historical trauma is passed down through generations, and they define that as multi-generational or intergenerational trauma. And we can think of this very simply as practices or behaviors or ways of being that are born in the interest of survival, but then persist much longer after that. And one of the pioneers in this field is Yael Danieli. And she talks, for example, about how parenting practices and socialization in families and communities, they sort of ripple out, they continue that intergenerational trauma. And so She's done a lot of work on the children of Holocaust survivors who, for example, may receive messages like, don't ask for help, it's dangerous, or never let your guard down. So most recently, there's been all this like fascinating research that there's turn towards the body. So epigenetic studies, studies of how trauma affects brain development. But I want to just stay here with multi-generational trauma because, as Daniele points out in this quote you see here, I think it offers a historian a way to think about families almost as the product of systems and families as systems in and of themselves, right? And not only that, it allows us to think about change over time because if it's intergenerational trauma, then we're working across generations, right? So what does it all add up to? If we wanted to use the parlance of research questions, these are the questions that I'm asking myself. What would it look like to take these findings and use them to shape a historical narrative about a family over the course of more than a century? How might we use trauma frameworks to understand large-scale historical events like exile and migration and religious persecution, of course? And if we do that, how could we see migrant cultural and religious practices as a sort of a form of personal and collective healing? So what you're going to hear today is my first attempt to do that. And I will need a lot more of your help during the Q&A, please. All right. So as I said, Luna is the eldest daughter of Turkish Jews. She's born in Bergama, Turkey, under the full moon of Passover in 1917. It wasn't called Turkey, of course. It was still called the Ottoman Empire, but not for too much longer. According to the biography written by her husband, Charles Starr, Luna was, quote, born to a family of rabbis, merchants, and magicians. The name Abuaf can be traced all the way back to the 15th century to an ancestor named Isaac Abuaf. And we know this because the spirit of Isaac told Luna that once. Like many European Sephardim, the Abuaf family left Spain after their expulsion in 1492, an exile that spurred their migration to the Ottoman Empire, where they remained for the next 4 centuries. And in fact, they only left when in 1922, the Turkish military set the port of Smyrna on fire, which ended the Greco-Turkish War, but it destroyed a lot of the city in the process. At this point, Moshe Abuaf used his considerable fortune to get his family to safety. And so it was that Moshe and his wife, Joya, found themselves in Paris in 1923, bringing with them their 3 children at the time, Rachel, Marcel, and Louise, known to us as Luna. So again, my questions begin here. What does it do to a family to be ripped out of their homes and their communities, to break with centuries of tradition that define who they are and tie them to something much larger than themselves? Could we think about the violence of migration as a kind of historical trauma in and of itself, a breaking with the everyday continuities that give us a sense of rootedness and place in the world? They settled in the 11th arrondissement, where, as I wrote in my first book, the working class neighborhoods of Sainte-Marguerite and La Roquette were home to thousands of foreign-born migrants and colonial subjects from about 1880 onward. But Quartier La Roquette in particular housed a very large, vibrant Greco-Turkish community of Jews, and they had very strong communal ties and deep roots in the neighborhood. Now, in the field of migration studies, you probably know, scholars always focus on immigrant communities. I mean, that's what I did. And more specifically, we're interested in how immigrants build a sense of community in alien countries. But, you know, as I approach this project and as I approach it through the lens of those trauma frameworks I mentioned before, I'm now wondering, you know, how could we think of community as a mode of or a space for collective healing? And can we map or what we might call a geography of collective healing, right? Sites of community gathering where Turkish and in this neighborhood, many Armenian migrants could recreate that rootedness that they had lost in their migration. Now there's some scholars like Annie Benveniste and Robin Buller, I don't actually know how to pronounce it, but they looked at prominent sites of Turkish Jewish sociability. And a lot of the times this is referred to as mythique café restaurant. These are the sorts of things that you see even here. So on the left, I believe you see l'Istanbul, which was this fancy cafe restaurant where a lot of Salonican Jews in particular congregated. It's on Rue Popincourt. It closed in 1946. And then you can see to the right, that is an image of Synagogue Siet, also on Rue Popincourt. And that was a synagogue that was very specifically for immigrant Sephardim. And it opened in 1930 when so many immigrants from that community came to Paris. We could also think of neighborhoods as sites of more solemn memory, right? As sites that acknowledge trauma as perhaps a way to heal as a collectivity. So here you see on the left a plaque on Rue Sedan that's dedicated to Jewish soldiers who fought in World War I. And then on the right, of course, a plaque honoring deported Jewish children in schools that you see posted up on schools throughout Paris. Now, the Abouafs were a part of this Ottoman Jewish community in La Rouquette. And, at least this is what Joya's granddaughter, Regine, remembers. And Regine would know. After the war, her grandmother, Joya, frequently took care of her when her mother, Luna, and her father, Charles, were away. And when I talked with Regine, she spoke of the immigrant Sephardic neighborhood through the eyes of the child that she was at the time. As she told me a few months ago, quote, "It seemed like everyone in the neighborhood was giving and borrowing and not paying for anything." And this is certainly the sense that I got from the neighborhood when I was looking at all my different primary sources for the last book. Now, Moishe started off as a humble marchand ambulant, right? This is what he was when he first arrived in Paris in the 1920s. But then by the 1930s, he was a very prosperous textile manufacturer. And in fact, in the decades before World War II, the Abouafs lived a rather comfortable existence. They could even afford to live in domestique, a co-religionist of theirs who appears in the census records as Dudu Eskenazi. The census also tells us that the Abouafs owned the entire building at 139 Rue de la Roquette, and that they lived above their own factory at that address. And if Google Maps is to be trusted, this is what that space looks like now. It is home rather inelegantly to an insurance company. But it was perhaps because of their relative wealth and status that they were such fixtures in the Sephardic community of the 11e. And that seems particularly true of Joya, who you see here on the right. And that's Luna all the way on the far right there. And you can tell because she's staring directly at you and sort of just daring you to mess with her. Joya used to help poor Jews in the neighborhood get married, not as a Jewish matchmaker, but these other things, sewing wedding dresses for soon-to-be brides, seemingly for free. She also offered the families very spacious quarters to Jewish couples who sought some sort of space to celebrate their nuptials. And, this is where I'm already starting to confront my ignorance on this. Is there a name for this? Is it some sort of a traditional practice, or was this just an idiosyncratic hobby of Joya's? Was Joya an incurable romantic and a lover of love? That would certainly explain why the loss of her husband, Moishe, broke her into pieces during the war. Perhaps because of their improved fortunes, the Abouafs sought naturalization in 1930. And here's where I'm on really familiar terrain, because I spent a lot of time on this in Reproductive Citizens. You see 5 children here in this photo, but in 1930, the Abouafs had 4 children, and naturalization proceeded very quickly. The prefect of police cited, quote, "la situation de famille" as the primary motivation. And it helped, too, that they sent their kids to the école laïque, and the whole family seemed assimilé. Here you actually see Luna in a French theater class, again, standing on the far right with that really formidable glare. But I do wonder how true that last bit is about being French assimilated. As Regine told me, her grandmother Joya certainly spoke French, but she much preferred Ladino, or the Judeo-Spanish common among Sephardic Jews who settled in the Ottoman Empire after expulsion from Spain. She never did like French food, Regine says, preferring instead Turkish dishes. And Regine remembers the smell of those foods, like shish kebab, lamb stew, yellow rice, fideos, a very different fare from what you'd find in the adjoining neighborhood of the Marais, where it was all matzo balls, tongues, and meatballs. And again, I can't help but think from this new perspective, is food maybe a way for a community in exile to hold on to tradition? And that may be obvious, but can we take it a step further? Can we think of food as a kind of healing practice of its own that offers the comforts of home and the comforts of familiarity in a very unfamiliar country? Here you see a painting by Luna called Ma Maison, and it indicates perhaps what the Abouaf household felt like. Joya's home was very Turkish, very Oriental. This is what Regine says. It was a place filled with warmth, food, colors, dancing. Joya offered visitors her homemade anise liquor, and she bid them smoke from the hookah pipe, which sat in the corner of the large room. She made them strong Turkish coffee, and then once they were done, she read the coffee beans at the bottom, sort of splattered like mud, but riddled with meaning. The Abuaf household was certainly marked by Sephardic tradition and Turkish customs, but the Abuafs recreated a very particular kind of religio-cultural milieu. They were adherents of Jewish mysticism or Kabbalah, which is a strain of Jewish faith that has a very unique history, almost too perfectly for my purposes. It appeared in 12th century southern France, in Provence, and scholars say that it reached maturity in 13th century Spain. So here I quote one religious scholar who writes that basically Kabbalists were interested in a very profound inner experience that they didn't think could be attained through simply rational, intellectual approaches to religion. And for them, systems of belief were these mystical symbols that reflected the mystery of God and the universe. And the Iberian Peninsula was naturally the main center of Jewish Kabbalism, but only until 1492. At that point, religious refugees spread across the continent. So Italy, North Africa, Ottoman Empire, Palestine. And there, Kabbalism mixed with other kinds of local traditions and trends. And in the Ottoman Empire, Spanish Kabbalists, they came into contact with earlier Kabbalistic trends, giving precedence to very ecstatic sorts of things, theories relating to the transmigration of souls or cosmic cycles and calculations of the end of days. These are precisely what we see in Luna's paintings. So in my book, I suggested that Frenchness, insofar as such a thing exists, was made perhaps more elastic during this period as a result of the crisis of depopulation that afflicted the country. Did naturalization officials look the other way when it came to these plainly Kabbalistic religious practices? Or were these the kinds of things that Moishe and Joya had to hide during the naturalization process? Although I argue that Frenchness was less rigidly policed than it would be after the war, I really don't want to push that thesis too far. At this time, it was still very important to demonstrate the strength of attachment to all things French if you wanted to become French citizens in the formal sense. And if that was indeed the case, Moishe and Joya very much succeeded in giving the right impression. The Abuafs earned French citizenship in the early 1930s. And so I can't help but wonder, at the start of the occupation, did they think that that citizenship would protect them? If so, they were mistaken. During the first roundup in 1941, Moishe Abuaf on the left and his eldest son, Marcel, on the right, they were snatched up off the street and sent to Pensee. And according to Luna, her father saw this coming 2 days before the roundup. At that time, he pulled her aside and he told her that she would hear reports that he had died, but she shouldn't believe them, and that, in fact, he would return to her in 30 or 40 years. She just had to be patient. And although her father and brother were confirmed dead, they'd appeared, as you can see here on the list of names of those killed in Auschwitz, Luna refused to believe that he was really gone. In her rendering, he escaped from Auschwitz to Russia after the war, but then he got amnesia, and so he couldn't remember who he was, let alone the family he had been separated from. In fact, though she actually did go by Louise for most of her life, she renamed herself Luna later in life because that was her father's pet name for her. And when she took to painting, she signed all of them with Luna Star, drawn in really large letters, which you could see down there at the bottom of these two paintings. She did that because she thought it would, her father would one day see this. And as she once put it, le choc would rouse him from his stupor, and his memories would come flooding back, and he'd find his way back to his true family, his beloved daughter. Now, to some, this reads as proof of the tenacious optimism that helped Luna survive. To others, her lunacy. Now, from our perspective, could we see it as a kind of magical thinking born of Kabbalistic belief systems, and as such a means of healing from a terrible historical trauma visited upon an entire community of people? In those early years of the war, Joya and Luna still had hope. They went straight to Drancy. They tried to bribe the guards and secure the release of Moishe and Marcel. And I can't help but wonder how Marcel and Moishe were holding up themselves. We do have this postcard from Moisha to Joya, but it's very emotionless. It's, just a list of supplies that he and his son needed, right? And it says to her, we can't have tobacco or alcohol or games, so don't bother including that anymore. And it can't weigh more than a certain amount. And here's some logistics on how to get all that to us. There is nothing there that would indicate how they would have spent their days and their nights and how they managed their fear and whether they thought they would be released or not. And when Moisha wrote to his wife and children, did he already have a sense of what the future held? Was he so spare in his words because he was already emotionally preparing himself for the worst that was also the inevitable? The first attempt to set them free didn't work, but Joya and Luna were not deterred. Somehow they struck up an acquaintance with a certain Madame Delmay, who claimed to have friends in high places, and even more specifically, connections in the Paris police. And according to family lore, she was the mistress of some heir to the Taittinger fortune. Now, was this Pierre Charles Taittinger, the Champagne magnate who helped found a far-right fascist youth group in the 1920s and who worked rather productively with the Nazis during the occupation before becoming a self-proclaimed resistant at the end of the war? It seems very possible that he was indeed the connection that Madame Delmay claimed to have had. And she told Joya and Luna that she could talk to her lover, a Nazi sympathizer with lots of Nazi friends, and get the Abuaf men out of Drancy. But there was only one hitch. She needed 20,000 francs. Now, I don't know why they couldn't pay that on their own. They were certainly wealthy enough. Maybe their assets had been frozen. All I know is that Joya and Luna turned to their French baker, Madame Rambaud, who was also on Rue de la Roquette. She offered bread to her Jewish neighbors, even when they didn't have the required meal ticket. And it would appear that her generosity knew no bounds. She loaned Joya and Luna 20,000 francs that they needed to pay off Madame Delmay. And sadly, you know what happened next. Joya and Luna produced the desired sum, but Madame Delmay didn't make good on her promise. In an extraordinary act of either desperation or bravado, Luna launched a civil suit against Madame Delmay in the middle of the war. And perhaps even more surprisingly, she won. And now I say this was an act of bravado because why on earth would a Turkish-born Jewish woman take the extraordinary step of making herself and her family visible in Nazi-occupied Paris? By taking Delmay to court, Luna was basically admitting that she sought to thwart the Nazis. I mean, whose crazy idea was this? Well, that's easier to answer. It was Luna's. Joya was illiterate, Luna wasn't. She alone must have undertaken all the legal maneuvering, and that's exactly the kind of thing that Luna would do. Why? I asked Regine. Luna was fearless, she says, calling her mother by her first name, the way all her children and grandchildren do. So, okay, I guess that explains the lawsuit, but how did they win? Did the Germans want to make an example of Delmay to make sure that people knew what would happen to them if they tried to help Jews, to warn people that not even their connections could spare them the wrath of Nazi law? Is that why the verdict was picked up in so many local papers? Here you see a snippet from L'Oeuvre. In the middle there, I think you have an Italian language French paper called La Petite Italie. And then we have a tiny write-up in Le Matin, that tiny little paragraph there. Joya and Luna, they may have won their case, and they may even have relished the sweet revenge against traitorous Madame Delmay, but in the end, it was cold comfort. On March 26, 1942, the family received a letter from Moisha telling them prisoners were being moved the next day, and indeed the very next day, Moisha and Marcel were placed on trains headed east, and they would perish only a year later. Luna and her mother were actually there at the train station the day they were sent away, hiding under an overhang, trying to catch a glimpse of them. They had, of course, been warned not to go because Germans would shoot unauthorized persons on sight, but they went anyway. And when they arrived, a cafe owner told them that many of the inmates had already been moved to the train station. And that's when they saw soldiers forcing about 100 Jewish prisoners toward the trains, and 3 cars were actually already closed when they arrived. They could hear the men yelling. And on that fateful day, Luna remembers seeing a man's hand reaching out the train window, and she remembers seeing a scrap of paper fluttering softly to the ground. And very foolishly, she ran to catch it and was seen by a German officer who got there before she did. So she and Joya were caught with seemingly no escape. until a French train conductor who happened to be part of the resistance on the opposite end of the tracks saw them, told them to jump on his train really quickly, and then dropped them off at the next stop. So what of that note? Luna clearly believes it was written by her father, but who's to know? When that German officer caught that bit of paper, did he read it or did he trash it? If the former, what might he have read in those few lines? Was it a final goodbye to loved ones, written in the hopes that the note would miraculously find its way to his family? Is it too naive to have hope for just that? Now, throughout the occupation, Luna and her family relied on the kindness of their neighbors, French and foreign. And not all of them were strangers, like Jean-Louis Loiret, that's the French train conductor that they met that day on the train platform. Some of them, like Madame Rambaud, that's the French baker, she was clearly well known to them. And the same could be said of Mr. Karayan, also known as Karayash, and about 15 other different spellings. This was their Armenian neighbor who lived across the street. Mr. Karayan was a jeweler whose whole family had been lost in the Armenian genocide and who nursed a lifelong hatred for Turks. Sephardic Jews from the homeland accepted, I suppose. Now, after the deportation of her husband and son, Joya just lost it in the middle of the night. She went out onto Rue de la Roquette in the dark hours of the morning, holding a pillow above her head and screamed, "My family is dead," at the top of her lungs. She woke up the neighborhood with her cries, and she risked drawing attention to herself and her neighbors in a city that was overrun by Germans and their very willing French helpmates. I wonder what her neighbors must have thought to see the veritable doyenne of the neighborhood unmoored in this way. If someone with her wealth and connections couldn't escape misfortune, what hope did any of them have? Kindly Mr. Karayan, who must have known Joya well, saw the danger that she was in and saw the danger she was putting everyone else in to boot. So he ran into the street and he shook her until she regained her senses. And it wouldn't be the last time that he'd prove himself to be the family's savior. For the rest of the war, Joya, Luna, and the other children hid in various apartments with various French neighbors and acquaintances. And at some point, actually, good old Mr. Karayan took them in, offering them sanctuary, and they remained with him for the duration of the war. Like many Jews, I would imagine, Joya was a changed woman after the war. As her granddaughter Regine recalls, she was a deeply depressed woman. And like so many other survivors from that generation, she probably suffered from survivor syndrome, which meant depression, but also withdrawal and apathy and seclusion. She didn't like to talk about life under the occupation, and she was traumatized by Nazism. Seeing the shell of a woman that she'd become, her granddaughter Regine tells me forcefully, "I was born in Paris and I speak French, but I choose not to have a French accent." Perhaps her own private resistance, maybe also her own private trauma response. But can healing come from anger? Or is that just another poison that we pass down to our children too? Now, in some ways, Luna couldn't have been more different from her mother. And this, again, is her rendering of Joya, called "My Mother Is Now an Angel." Joya was slow-moving and slow-thinking. Luna was strong-willed and impetuous. Luna's own daughter described her as having a violent personality. And so I imagine that meant very frequent clashes with her mother. When, after the war, Luna moved with her new husband to New York, was she at least in part trying to escape the relationship? Had the war and the death of her father and brother exceeded her emotional capacity such that she had little energy to fight with the mother who still lived? For all their differences, though, Luna does resemble her mother in one very important way. So like Joya, she was very religious, and this is most plainly visible in her artwork, which blended, like I said before, biblical stories and mystical beliefs and her wartime experiences. In an interview from the early aughts, Luna described her worldview and creative process. The name of the painting she was discussing was, rather too perfectly, Mystique Orientale, and she's sort of speaking in the stream of consciousness. She talks of visions and of prophets. She says, "When I close my eyes, I see colors and people." And those people included deceased family members that were long lost ancestors, also angels and aliens. In other interviews, Luna often said that her artwork was also based on her dreams. Which all begs the question, what did the critics have to say? And you see here, one described her work as d'inspiration orientale, conveying une harmonie biblique, depicting un monde mystique et plein d'espoir dans lequel prend place la vie humaine. And what about Luna herself? This same journalist wrote that she was un être poétique, inspiré, une force poétique, pure et naturelle. For her own part, Luna self-describes as a mystical painter, in that her paintings feature depictions of angels and the Torah to reflect her vision of her work as a gift from God. She called herself une juive libérale, mais orthodoxe de cœur. And when she first started painting in her 60s, she just did it because she wanted to jog her memory of the war and the occupation years. And so you've already seen a few of those, right? Mystique Orientale, the one of Joya. But her most well-known work of art is this one, the first deportation of the Jews from Paris, France, from the train station at Le Bourget, Drancy, March 27, 1942. This is the one that's in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. And this is the information that they offer. It is a mystical oil painting, and it commemorates the day that Luna witnessed the first deportation of Jews from Drancy via a train from Paris. Clearly a very colorful painting. As someone recently pointed out to me, it's sort of reminiscent of Chagall in terms of the abstract expressionism. You can see that there are these trains that are loaded with prisoners. They're surrounded by symbolic images of angels and animals and the Torah. In the foreground, there are these two sets of train tracks, right, with faces painted in very muted colors within the rails. And then between the tracks are several human figures and fish painted in white and light brown. Then there's this rainbow surrounded by angels that crosses the tracks, and these brightly colored figures in the lower corners. In the center is a large group of prisoners in gray and white striped uniforms, and they're marching in rows toward a large train in the middle ground. And our soldiers in green uniforms, and they're loading prisoners onto the train. And then near the front of the train, there are two figures in dark clothing, and one is bent over to pick up a piece of paper dropped from the train. And finally, in the upper background, you see a very brightly colored scene with the Torah and several non-realistic figures and animals below 5 archways. And throughout all of this, there are, like I said, lots of angelic figures interspersed. And there's, again, reason to believe that these were the deceased ancestors with whom Luna communed. And this is when I have another question. In her 60s, severed from her family members who have been lost to her, could communing with generations of long gone ancestors have been a means of surrounding herself with a loving family, the likes of which she'd lost during the war? A way to perhaps reestablish connections with those taken from her? And if so, can we think of that aspect of her belief system as having offered a measure of healing? There's also French text inscribed on the back, and these sorts of inscriptions appear on a lot of her work. So on the top, you see folks that she's honoring with her artwork. Always, it's dedicated to her father and her brother and other family members. And then, as you can see in the image below, on the back of her paintings, she also would write dedications to her family's wartime saviors, which always included the baker, Madame Rambaud, Monsieur Loiret from the train, and Mr. Carian, their neighbor. And on this painting, you can see the inscription of all those different people to whom she is dedicating this painting, as well as other people that I hope to find one day in the archives. This is another painting, what I saw in Paris during World War II. Clearly the war, the occupation, the murder of over 6 million Jews haunted her for the rest of her life. And Regine remembers that at dinner time, Luna would often break down and cry, and that, like her mother, she too was traumatized by a war. But as psychologists have revealed, the same traumatic event can affect different people differently. So for Joya, we see sort of a grim determination to keep on going. And in Luna, we see more of a spirited ferocity that she had her whole life. Luna seems to have found release in her artwork. These works reflected a very uniquely spiritual worldview, which I'm calling an almost magical understanding of her family's experience during war and occupation, and perhaps offered the best means of making sense of and coming to terms with and ultimately hearing from past that was riddled with uncertainty, instability, and violence on a mass scale. And when I first started talking with the Abuah family, I remember Luna's grandson, Dan. He was initially very hesitant about sharing any of these stories with me. Lots of people think she's crazy, he said. And I took it as both a warning and a way of sort of feeling me out, right? Was I one of those people? Was I going to cast her as a lunatic? I think that's what he was really asking me. Based on what I know, Luna Star certainly has a big and colorful personality, right? And I wonder, was it the war and its losses that made her like that, or had she always been that way? No one's really sure, Dan said. In other cultures, she would be considered a prophet. And so what if we did that? Think of Luna perhaps not as a prophet, but perhaps also not quite the eccentric that she's always made out to be. I guess I'm wondering, what could a project like this look like if I took a page out of Ruth Harris's book? She wrote about Lourdes, as you may recall, and in that book, she explores the young Bernadette Soubirous, whose sighting of the Virgin Mary was like a shot in the arm to French Catholicism in the 19th century. And in describing the Catholic fever that swept France thereafter, Harris creates new ways of thinking about faith. Certainly, she advocates for an objective reading, but she also advocates for a sympathetic reading of Lourdes and the people who went there looking for miracles. In other words, she doesn't reduce their experiences to some sort of false consciousness, and she doesn't ridicule their belief system either. To some, Luna was puzzling, and her way of thinking was baffling. But if I follow in Harris's footsteps, how can I see and how can I portray Luna as pursuing healing on her own terms? Terms that were perhaps magical, but they were always meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And I have to say, poetic. A lot of your ways of conjuring up the family really made a vivid story. So thank you so much. We will take Q&A from the audience. Sorry, the chat doesn't work, but the Q&A should work. So I will wait for people's questions to populate. And I'd like to ask you, this sort of idea of using trauma-informed theory to go back in history, do you think we can do that for other time periods more distant in the past? Or is this something that, because you have family stories and really personal information about this set of characters, you can kind of get to their emotional experience in a way that mightn't be possible for people, families in the more distant past? So your thoughts on that?
Oh, I completely agree with you. I think, well, I thought I was really careful about not trying to conjure up people's intimate emotions in the first book, but apparently I was not successful at that because many people will often use the word intimacy and, affective this. And I didn't even think that's what I was doing in the first book. So imagine how much easier it is to do when folks are talking to me and telling me this and that. Even Luna, who is no longer verbal, but there's tons of little like YouTube clips where she's talking about her various paintings. So, it makes it a lot easier to speak to the subjectivities here. And I should also say, I don't know if I already said this, but Alfie, that is the great-granddaughter of Joya, who's the woman on the cover of the book. She's actually doing a documentary right now, and she's very interested in the trauma piece as well, and she's very interested in healing. She's already shared like some personal stories with me that make this also a very personal project for her. And so I think it helps that I'm approaching this project in many ways through the lens of both Alfie and her brother Dan, because these are the kinds of questions they're asking themselves, which are, innately sort of personal stories. But I do also want to say it's perhaps not very different, shocking, surprising to be using a trauma lens to talk about the Holocaust and Holocaust survivors. And I think one of the things I'm interested in, this is just from reading a lot of literature about racial trauma in the United States. It's got me thinking a lot more about other things that I don't know that we, at least as historians, maybe, I don't know that we consider trauma, like forced exile and forced migration and being chased out of places, right? And yeah, so I guess I just want to leave it there. I think that, again, I'm in a unique position where I could make that argument. And so I will.
It sounds fair. Now we have a few questions from the chat, and I wanted to see if people wanted to ask them themselves. Eric, would you like me to read out your question, or shall I unmute you? Let's see. Oh, all right. Failing that, I will ask Eric's question for him. This is from Eric Jennings at University of Toronto, who says, fascinating presentation. Can you tell us how your work draws from the spatial turn in French Holocaust studies? For example, Sarah Gensberger.
I cannot. I am this is another primary example of how I haven't really been a French historian for the last 10 years. I appreciate you telling me about this book and telling me that there is this literature. It's something that I should probably look into. And so thank you.
All right. Great. Now a question from Judith Miller. And she said, this was wonderful. Thanks. And so much to think about. She was struck by the painting of the family women. Their eyes are so large, and yet their mouths are small or even non-existent. So do you have any thoughts?
So I haven't done close readings of the paintings themselves yet, though I have been talking a lot with her, with Alfie and Dan. Alfie's actually trying to collect all of Luna's paintings so that she can put on like an exhibition. And one of the things that at least Alfie has been noticing in terms of everything that she's collecting is that women are really at the forefront of kind of all of the paintings. And it's interesting what you say about how their mouths are very small, because I don't get the sense that that's the way that Luna lived her life. I think she lived her life very, very loudly, to the consternation of some people. And so, you know, I even think, you know, even if we were to think about how did she get by during the Second World War, I mean, I have a lot of questions about that, because it would make sense to be sort of slinking around and hiding the whole time. But then she did this crazy thing by taking someone to court and then winning. So, you know, maybe this is the way that she saw women around her. Maybe this is the way that she interpreted folks like Joya, maybe some of her other family members who were there. We know that she has a couple of aunts that were living in the neighborhood as well. But it's certainly not how she lived. I feel comfortable saying at least that much.
Right. That's really, you know, it is fascinating, right? Her perspective on the community around her, right? Is she giving them a voice, or is she sort of highlighting some other part of what they witnessed maybe with their eyes? Now we have a question from William Nelson, and he asks, how are you conceptualizing trauma? One of the things he thought he noticed in the Haynes quote about trauma was a focus on systems and acts that produce trauma. And he's wondering if you could say more about what you think these systems and acts produce. How willing are you to go into the psychological and somatic dimensions of trauma in your subjects? So this is maybe a disciplinary and a methodological question.
Yeah. I think this really gets at something I alluded to at the start, which is I don't see myself having a very traditional academic audience. And what I mean by that is in terms of what a project like this would look like, if it looked like anything, if I was even able to do this, it would not be heavily footnoted. It would, I don't know how many of you have read Sarah Horowitz's Red Widow. It's very good. Definitely read it. I see myself writing something more like that, and sort of being in a position where I allow myself to make informed guesses and you know, assert sort of informed hypotheses. So what that means, to answer your question directly, yeah, in terms of the psychological and somatic stuff, I will have to have a very light hand there. And based on what Regine and Alfie say to me directly, you know, I can perhaps go a little further than I would feel comfortable with if I wasn't speaking directly to people. I guess I would also say that I think one of the things I'm thinking about a lot is how structures of, structures of poverty, structures of exile, the conditions which create those structures, right? So yes, exile, war, but isn't it sort of also global capitalism that makes people fight over scant resources? And then isn't it also, connected to the rise of nationalism and the ways that, peoples became unsorted in the most violent of ways in spaces like the Ottoman Empire, what became Turkey, and how that, I think that's sort of where my head is at in terms of thinking about more, how structures are going to allow me to tell the kind of story that I want to tell. But I do think you're right. I'm really flirting with the boundaries of disciplinary disciplinary boundaries right now. And I sort of want to have my cake and eat it too. I want to be a little bit of a historian, and then I also want to suggest that there's another human story inside of this. And I think that there's both. I think there's scholarship on this. I think that there's evidence for this in my conversations with Alfie and Regine and Dan and all the rest. And so I'm really curious what it'll add up to, if anything.
Yeah, it makes me sort of think about this prohibition that we have about diagnosing people retrospectively, in the past with various conditions. But the idea here of and I don't have the right terminology, but, kind of this intergenerational transmission of trauma, right? You're arguing that actually we could look back and say, well, I can have an understanding of what this person might have been dealing with, and not that you're going to diagnose them with, I don't know, some disease, which we have seen, but, this kind of, you're identifying a physical thread, even back to people that you don't have evidence for. So anyways, that's very, very interesting.
Can I also just say, I definitely don't want to psychologize anyone. That is something I'm not interested in. But as you may have just heard, even in this presentation, I sort of frame it as questions. So I'm sort of implanting the idea that, hey, maybe this is happening, because it is. It's very generative of a lot of questions, right? And I think now we're talking a little bit more in terms of narrative style here, but I think that that's one way to get your point across. I remember when I was trying to write my dissertation, and I didn't know how to put all these sources together. And I remember reading, the classics, Christine Stansel's City of Women. Oh gosh, I forgot her name. Laurel Ulrich, Midwives. Yeah. And I saw the way that they would take these small bits of evidence and weave a story together. And then I never felt that I never felt that they were overshooting, because their narrative style made it such that it felt always as an invitation, like, hey, I wonder if this was happening. Maybe that was happening. And in the process, you then begin to ask yourself, that does seem like, I wonder if that was what was happening. And that does seem very likely, right? So I think there's also kind of like that narrative stylistic element that will also dovetail with the audience that I'm writing for, whoever they may be.
I was just talking to a class of graduate students yesterday about sort of biography and, when are you allowed to make imaginative leaps when there are gaps in the record? And I was saying, well, I think Natalie Zeman Davis did that so that we can now, right? Because she sort of says, I did this for Martin Guerre, I might be wrong, but I am going to kind of make this imaginative leap. And then, of course, based on, this extremely rich set of footnotes, et cetera. So, right, I think that probably when Laurel Ulrich was writing, she had to absolutely document every single tiny thing from the diary or whatever, but maybe now we are in that mode of like we can accept some amount of historical imagination in a certain type of history. But
well, then also, this is the last thing I'll say about it, but a lot of the trauma literature that exists right now, there's a lot of cognitive leaps also in the other direction, about present day trauma theories and frameworks. and sort of projecting it back into history. So I don't know, there's a lot of bridging happening there right now.
Yeah, yeah. So now there are quite a few questions. I think we will go at least another probably 20 minutes, half an hour. So I think we have some time. Depends on how you're holding up. But Deb Neal says, thanks so much for your presentation. What rich material. Her question, could you reflect further on how this family story challenges assumptions about women in French society in this period and about life under occupation? The agency of a young woman bringing a court case really stands out in surprising ways. So.
Oh, I agree. I think that court case, for me, it's actually still very hard to wrap my head around. It just seems like such an unwise decision to have made. But I will also say that in Reproductive Citizens, in that last chapter where I talked about gender and reproduction during under Vichy, one of the things that I found was there were a few specifically Jewish immigrant women in the neighborhoods who would go straight to the police prefect and ask for, food coupons and tickets and sometimes money. And there's even this one woman, I think her name was like Sophie Chalisevich or something like that. And she was a divorced, was she French born? I don't know, but either Polish or Russian, definitely French naturalized woman who had at least one, maybe two children, but as I said, was divorced. And she wrote this like scathing letter to, I think it must have been like the French Welfare Bureau there in Paris, just being really testy about not having received her welfare benefits. And this was another one of those moments where I thought, wow, the nerve, but in the best way possible, more like the moxie. And I think for me, that for me was part of, the only power, the only power that the women that I study have lay in their reproductive abilities and capacities, their ability to successfully represent themselves as widows and wives and mothers and abandoned and like in this very poor state, not just socioeconomically, but like emotionally too, in order to sort of get the benefits, whether emotional or financial or whatever, legal, from the state that they need to get, and more specifically from the state's intercessors, which of course are mostly men. And so I wonder to myself, is that something that was happening in this particular scenario? Maybe that would make sense for Joya, but not Luna. Luna wasn't reproductively active. She didn't have children, and she wouldn't until well after the war. So I don't know, something for me to continue to think about. So thank you for raising that.
Yeah. One question from Marlene Levinsky, just wondering, could you just repeat Luna's name just to find her art online?
Yeah,
so it's Lounah, and what's her last name?
Her last name is Starr, Starr.
Okay.
She also did go by Louise Starr or Louise Abouaf before she married.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, and actually, if you Google her, you'll find all these clips on YouTube where she's describing her art and her process.
Wow, great. All right, so we have a couple more questions, and actually, this is a follow-up from William about sort of trauma, so we can kind of revisit that. But he thinks it's great, maybe necessary, for historians of trauma to really get into the lived experience of trauma, and that requires engaging with the psychological and somatic dimensions of trauma. And so in his perspective as a historian, he doesn't think it's problematic to engage with those. So in order for the discussion of trauma to have some depth and weight, it seems like maybe that's beneficial to get into it, right? So,
phew, I'm glad you think so. I always worry that, especially with a project like this, I always, I worry that it would seem too unscholarly, right? Because was it Eric who earlier pointed out that there's clearly this vast literature that I don't know anything about, and so I worry that it's not informed historiographically in the way that historians would want it to be, and which makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the ways I'm trying to get around that is by thinking about how I just how I talk about the project and like how far I'm willing to go with the trauma frameworks. So it's actually very, I really appreciate what you say. I feel like you just gave me a little bit of carte blanche to go deep there.
Endorsed by William Nelson.
Exactly.
It would be interesting to see when this becomes a book, because it sounds, you seem, well, there are many steps between now and then, but how it will kind of relate to the documentary, right? Or, does it offer a very different reading? How do you kind of build on, using the same sources from these, these family members, but take things in a potentially different direction?
So actually, Alfie's taking me as her personal historian to Paris in a couple of weeks, and we're going to be visiting all the archives, and I'll be doing like a neighborhood tour. And it's the first time I've been back to Paris since many, many years ago. And that is very exciting because obviously I'll be doing the stuff that she needs for her documentary, but then I'll also have these moments to kind of do some little exploratory research of my own, which sounds very fun to me, as this is not something I've done in a very long time. The last book that I wrote, the DEI book, I mean, it's very it's very sort of drawing on my personal and professional experiences. And it's sort of like, this is the state of higher education as it pertains to diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is where we're going wrong. Here's a little bit of history. Here's a little bit of what I experienced in the classroom. So that was a very different process, right? It's not, it's research, but not with like primary sources, the way that historians do. So this is me sort of going back in a lot of ways to that methodology and that process. And who knows what I'll find. So, yeah.
Right. It's kind of, the chance to say, well, I wrote about this set of characters and this set of issues, but now, and I think it happens whenever, right? Whenever you finish a book and then you're like, oh, I wish I could have added this, or, so maybe you're getting a chance, right, to fill in some holes and then, pursue things further.
Just
There's
really
another question.
I also say that
Yeah.
I'm reading James Macaulay's House of Fragile Things, and it is so well done, and it is so beautiful. And I think that's the kind of book I want to write, perhaps even evoking the historiographical stuff even less. It's just so beautifully written, and yeah, everything. So everyone go read that book.
Excellent. One question from Judith Miller, and she's wondering about that painting of Drancy, right? And the caption specifically you showed us on the back. And there seem to be these different kind of typographic ways that the captions were written on the back, the difference between these capital I's and lowercase i's. Do you know anything about that? Was that just Luna's idiosyncratic personal labeling, or what the significance of those are?
The easiest thing would be to say that, yes, it was probably her idiosyncrasies. And I don't mean that, I don't mean to, in a way, to write her off. I mean, she was very well known for being very idiosyncratic, right? But perhaps there is another story there, and perhaps I can and should ask more questions about it. Thank you for pointing that out.
All right, now someone has a hand up. Let me see if I can figure that out. All right, whose hand is up? Okay, maybe Judith, is that following up on this question? Or is that? Okay.
And Judith, yes. I'm actually looking again, and I mean, that's definitely the case for the text that is typed out, but she also hand wrote all this stuff on the back of the painting. And I don't have it in front of me right now, but I wonder if that was just some sort of strange thing that happened in the translation, but I could be wrong.
All right, Judith. Would you like to speak? I'm not sure. Let's see. You're muted. All right, I'll move on. And okay,
I think
so
sorry, it took me a while to figure out. No, it's just, it's so systematic. If the I falls in the middle of the word, it's a small I. If it's anywhere else in the word, it's a capital I along with all the other capital letters. And so I was intrigued by, what kind of choice is that? It's absolutely systematic.
Interesting.
That is really interesting. I I have no clue. And sorry, Judith, did you see that on is it just in the printed section, or is this on the actual?
It was on the slide that you showed.
Yes.
That had the captions. And I was just like, so I was wondering, who did this? Why did they do that? What does it, because it's absolutely systematic. If the I is dead center in the word.
Yes. Yes,
yeah.
I don't know, but this is just like a typed out version of what appears in handwritten form on the back of her paintings. So I don't
maybe nothing then. Yeah.
Yeah, let me actually, I think I could pull up the site right now and drop it into the chat box. But thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, let me check.
I was going to ask actually sort of whether you think Joya's illiteracy had an impact on Luna later in life. And then also, does Luna ever talk about her other siblings other than her brother? Or
Luna never talks about her siblings, except for Marcel. Luna's sort of doing her own thing in her own world, doing her own thing. You know, she talks a lot about ancestors, really ancestors who are no longer with us. Well, they're with Luna, but they're, you know, no longer sort of with us in a concrete or tangible sense. Yeah, I actually just learned that a couple of her brothers and sisters, one of her brothers is actually still in Paris, and that's sort of the family is spread out all over the world right now. It is interesting though how they talk about Luna as sort of being this matriarch, you know, which is so interesting because my way into this conversation was thinking of Joya as the matriarch. But there's something interesting happening where in the, you know, Luna's star is this like star, this star attraction that brings everyone's sort of attention, even within the family, for better and for worse. So
there's one more question from Irem Baltas, who asks, could Luna's affinity to mysticism be seen as a gateway to liberation rather than solely a response to trauma? So world making through mysticism.
Ooh, I had not even considered that. I think that is amazing. I think that's a fantastic idea. Oh yes, world making, world of our own design. Oh, I love this idea so much. I very much want to play with it. Thank you so much. I think you could be absolutely correct in that. You know, because some of these themes, a lot of the story I'm telling is like sort of a haunting one, a dark one, but her paintings don't look that way, right?
Right.
And it's very much sort of like a canvas of her emotional canvas of what's going on with her inside her. And again, you can almost see the optimism in all those paintings with these bright colors, even when depicting these like really terrible things. But yes, thank you so much for this idea about the world making and the liberation. I really love this. I'm going to look into it more. Thank you so much, whoever you are.
Well, I think that brings us to the end of the formal question list. I don't know if anyone has any final requests or thoughts they want to offer. I do wish we could see the audience. It's really disconcerting and kind of lonely to just see these little bubbles that are people's names, but not actually their faces. So, but it's been absolutely delightful to talk to you, just to sort of see the possibilities for this project, and you know, again, to hear more about your first book, but then to see new directions for some of these same questions. So thank you so much for joining us. We're really glad to be able to you know, have this conversation all the way from LA. We're glad you didn't come to Toronto right now. It's not the right time of year to come to Toronto.
Thank you so much for inviting me. And I just want to say thank you to the invisible audience out there. I'm very rusty when it comes to history and presenting on new projects. I haven't had a new project in 15 years or something. So thank you so much for all these excellent suggestions and really good questions. And Eric, I'll be emailing you later so that I can learn about the spatial thing you were talking about.
Well, there are thanks in the chat, and you know, people who are going to be wanting to see where this book when it appears. So you have to write it now. So, all right.